And you know what he said? He's like, Dad, how about we talk about some of the good things as well? Oh my God, that made me feel so bad. It didn't even occur to me. And he had to say it.
That is Ahmed Khattak, the guest for today's episode. In today's episode, you'll hear Ahmed share the story of when he struggled to empathize with his father and his son. He also talks about a time when he struggled to empathize with his employees under lockdown, working from home. Not an easy topic to discuss in a public forum, given his status as a CEO. Join me in holding space for Ahmed to reflect honestly. Welcome to the journey of realizing empathy. I think we all have experienced the moment in our lives when we suddenly empathize with somebody we previously did not, by experiencing a moment of realization. One where we went, aha, oh, or maybe even burst out with laughter concerning something we either did not or had incorrectly assumed to understand and appreciate enough. While these realizations can sometimes be had in a few minutes, it can also take years. In fact, it may never happen. It is a seemingly simple yet complex and lifelong process of realizing empathy that I wish to explore in all of our episodes. Hey there, listener. My name is Slim. I help startup founders in their maturation as a leader and a CEO by helping them confront themselves in a true mirror. And I believe few things serve as a truer mirror than the challenges we face in our interactions with other people. The Journey of Realizing Empathy is a show where we explore how our challenges with other people can ultimately serve as a true mirror that helps us mature as leaders and human beings. In each of our episodes, we host a guest who tells a story of a time in their life when they struggled to empathize with one or more people until a series of realizations moved them to empathize with those very people. Welcome, Ahmed.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming on. Would you be willing to briefly introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Ahmed Khattak. I'm currently the CEO of US Mobile, which is a wireless network operator, like offering 4G and 5G services. We are ranked 94th on the fastest growing private companies in America. So, we've grown quite a bit over the last couple of years. And before US Mobile, after graduating from college, scaled another e-commerce company to more than $100 million in global sales. And between both the companies, I worked with more than 500 people that we hired.
Excellent. And I just want to acknowledge how much I personally appreciate you for coming on the show and for accepting the invitation, because we live in an era where the word empathy has somewhat become weaponized. And sometimes it's difficult to talk about times when we're struggled to empathize. It's far easier to talk about, look at me, how much empathy I have, what a wonderful person I am. So I think in some small yet significant ways, talking about your struggles, I think is an act of bravery. So for that, I thank you.
I appreciate it.
Absolutely. All right. So to set the stage for the interview today, could you briefly tell us what relationship we'll start by reflecting on?
I think when talking about empathy and the lack thereof, or having it, the realization, what better people talk about than your parents? And the inflection point is when you become a parent.
Yeah.
Incredible, the kind of realization then you get. That is one of those things where it really takes you a lifetime to realize a few things. And you have your own. So I think it makes sense to talk about, I guess, my dad.
Sounds good. So take us back to a moment in your life where you want the story to begin.
I guess I'm going to start with early 2000s when I think my dad was struggling a little bit in his life as well. And I think this is when I was in high school. So it was a perfect storm for a disaster, right? You're a teenager and you have so many emotions running through you, and My dad, from a career perspective, wasn't where he always envisioned that he'd be at. And I think that'd be an interesting time to kind of talk about this.
What was going on at the time?
My dad was a fighter pilot in the Air Force,
Oh.
one of the most successful ones, flew some of the most important planes that Pakistan Air Force had. And then so we look up to him as that superstar. And he comes from and he didn't come from money at all. Actually, he came from a very small village in Pakistan which is still below poverty. People over there still live at less than $1 a day. So I remember him telling me that when he was in high school and getting ready for his high school exams before college or joining the Air Force Academy, he was studying till 3 in the night under a lantern because they didn't have electricity. They didn't have electricity till the 1990s, and it's 1970s. And his mom came to him and said he should stop studying, and she didn't say that because she wasn't necessarily worried about dad eyesight becoming screwed up because he was studying under low light. She said that because they were not sure whether they'd be able to afford fuel for the next day. So that's the kind of background my dad came from. And then he was a superstar in the Pakistan Air Force, stationed places, and really on his way to have become a 3-star general. That's what I always looked at him like that. And then in one of his boards, you get promoted to the next rank. For him, it was to a general. He wasn't, because he didn't get along with the chief of air staff at that time. And I remember my dad taking that phone call where he was informed that they hadn't promoted him. And when that happens in Pakistan Air Force, the very next year you're out of the Air Force. So I still remember that look in my dad's eyes. And so this is a time when he had been informed that, and he was spending his last year in the Air Force, as someone who was on his way out when his course mates had become generals. So it's like a double whammy, right? It's you have to figure something out now, but then it's like a walk of shame per se, because you're still in the Air Force. I'm out there. So that was a time for him. And for me, I was giving my A-levels, which is like junior, senior year in America. And it had coincided with 9/11. And so it was an interesting time for someone like me to be growing up in Pakistan, wanting to go abroad for my education, but at the same time, because of 9/11, all doors being closed on us just because of out there. It's a mixture of both of these.
Wow. Like you said, the perfect storm. This could not have been more of a storm. So what emotions did you feel at the time when you were informed, I'm assuming, about your dad's lack of promotion at the time?
Upset. And for me, my dad was the best that there ever was and will be. And I still remember the look on his face. And if you want to do something for them, but you cannot. And then in that moment, it was that. And that obviously then changes into as time passes, some of those emotions evolve. But I think that's what I felt like.
Upset. That's where it began.
Yeah, upset and angry, for sure.
Angry. Yeah. And then what emotions were you feeling about the fact that you were living in a time where you had aspirations to study abroad, but the 9/11 had just occurred?
Uncertainty and a little bit of resignation and hopelessness. I had been admitted to 2 of the top universities in Australia, University of Melbourne and University of New South Wales, for mechanical engineering. That's what I think they rejected my visa 4 times. And just because you had 9/11 happen, 21 people did that, but now 1.5 billion Muslims were kind of on trial for that. And they were trying to figure out whether you were a threat to them or not. And then doing that over a course of 8-9 months. And then this is when you're 17, 18 years old and you're a smart kid who's done very well in school. And so for sure, that was the hopelessness, was getting towards that resignation, I would say. Not entire hopelessness, but I think definitely those are the kind of emotions that were evoked at that time.
Wow. These are not easy emotions to be embodying at the moment. And then walk us through what happened next.
What happened next from
the moment you heard that story, that your father is not going to be promoted?
The immediate aftermath was there's some people who came over to our house, some of his junior officers, condole him on not being promoted because he really was one of the best Air Force officers out there. And they all came with a sense of shock on wait, how did that not happen? So you basically are in shock in that moment, in those few days. But then now my dad was commanding an air base, and since he wasn't promoted, they had a new officer had to come in and he had to vacate the house. I remember we were moving and the movers were here cleaning our house out so that he could go to his next rotation in the Air Force for the last 1 year that he had over there. And I was I was disappointed and really upset, and so was my dad. And it's a really good example of a certain level of apathy, right? Because it's basically what happens is I was upset that he wasn't promoted, and like it felt like our life had just come down crashing. And for him, it had actually happened. And so for me to respond to that, the movers at our house, but I wasn't helping. I was sitting and I was like doing my own thing. And I remember my dad came to me and he was really upset, and he said to me that I'm broken, but I'm still helping the movers get out of this house, and you're sitting there. But really, I was sitting there because I was really upset for him and like pretty helpless as well. And even though I was a very young kid at that time, I think I could have showed a lot more empathy in terms of he'll be all right and stuff like that. But it's hard, right? Because you look up to someone who has achieved everything in his life, and then all of a sudden, like it just comes down crashing, and then you don't have a script for that. Like, how do you react to that? For me, I was angry at this and like went to my dad and I said, you should like leave the Air Force immediately. Now that there's nothing in there for you, like why even stay for the next 2 years? Like, just, armed forces and Air Force officers are highly respected in our society in Pakistan, and you'd be able to get a really great job outside and be very successful at it. So like, why even stay around? And I remember telling him, and that there's like they're like fighter pilots. Like there's the Air Force in Pakistan is made for fighter pilots, right? They're like the ones who like are the top tier. So there are air bases that are called like the fighter air, and then there's like some backup air bases in Pakistan for like logistics. And one of them is it's called the Pakistan Air Force Base Korangi. It's in suburb of the biggest city in Pakistan, Karachi. But like really, that's not where fighter pilots go. And I remember telling my dad, don't let the Air Force treat us bad. Don't let them send us to PF Base Korangi. And I didn't even know that was going to happen. I just said it because that was the worst thing that could happen to us. And guess what? In 2 weeks, we heard that he was being transferred to out there. And so the next year after that was pretty unsettling, right? Because for him, that was just like being in PF Base Korangi was a constant reminder of the fact that he hadn't made it where he wanted to. And that evoked a lot of emotions in him, fury, resentment, because of the fact that and then like a little bit of hopelessness as well, like mixed, like a cocktail of all of these things that, hey, what am I going to do next? I had my whole planned out, but now I have to I'm 45 years old and now I have to figure this out. And I've got kids who are in high school, like how will I pay for them? And I really wish that we had understood that better. It's funny because that realization comes to you. Like I have three kids now. Like I have a 9-year-old and I have a 6-year-old and now I have a 1-month-old. And like specifically, I'm realizing this with my 9-year-old boy. It's like this constant, like I have to remind him of, like, it's like, don't take life for granted. You should need to show empathy in your life. You look at what we did for you or here, what we did for you here. Like, and then I'm talking to my wife all the time about, oh my God, look at what we do for these kids. And there's so much lack of empathy. And then, but like a lot of these realizations as a dad, it's happening. I'm like, okay, let's rewind 20 years. And like, this is, I'm sure what my dad must have felt like.
Yeah. It's one of those things that until you get to a place where the other perspective becomes resonant to you, it's very difficult to cross that threshold, especially when you're in your teenage years and in high school. And at the same time, when you're in high school, you were probably focused on your own life, right? Less so on what's going on with your parents, and like just any high school kids for that matter, in most cases. So I want to make sure that we don't necessarily brush off your past self as some kind of entitled, know-it-all kid who took anything for granted. I want to make sure that we accept that child as they are and talk a little bit more honestly about what it was like back when you were in high school, confronted with the situation. Because from your perspective, you're working hard, you have aspirations, you want to go to school here and there, and the world seems to be conspiring against you, making your life more miserable and taking away your dreams. Your father was going through a situation where he was not getting promoted. And it was probably very natural for you to take that personally for yourself as, wow, so this is making my life even more difficult. I want to get a little bit more insight into what it was like when you were in high school, facing the situation where you had your own aspirations dampened, and presumably because there's some family issues were happening at the same time. Could you talk a little bit more into that?
Yeah, sure. When something like that happened to me at that time, like it's like I found it very challenging to stay connected to someone else's problems at that time.
Yes.
Like, okay, I'm having such a hard time in my life, and like, how will someone solve these issues. I remember this, I had gotten admitted into one of the most prestigious like schools in Pakistan. And now my dad is like on his way out in the Air Force, right? We're in Karachi right now, and I got admitted into that school. And so I went for a past interview, and then on our way back, they had given us a list of books that I had to buy. And it was like, and just the tuition was like 80,000 rupees. So I remember, and 80,000 rupees was like 2x my dad's monthly salary. And so we're driving back, and dad is angry, and I'm like, wait, what are you angry about? Like, I just got into the best high school, and one of the best high schools in Pakistan. And he's, I don't know how I'm going to pay for this, but I have unlimited dreams, and this is what's going to help me achieve that. And I remember him saying, but my resources are limited. And I'm not sure whether I reacted very positively to that in that moment.
How did you react?
And this is 20 years back. So I'm thinking whether I said something to him, or I remained quiet. Perhaps I remained quiet, but the point is, what really helps in this moment is that, hey, Dad, I understand your resources are limited. I'm going to get a part-time job. I'm going to work to maybe perhaps pay 50% of that tuition. I'm out there. You know what? That's all he needed to hear. Yeah. And that's it. He would have never let me do a part-time job based on my workload. But this is what he needed to hear in that moment, right? Yeah. And that is like classic lack of empathy, right? The idea that someone who is much older than you, your dad, like he's a superhero and he doesn't need that empathy. That's not true at all. So I think those are definitely one of the more vivid memories I have of perhaps I could have done it differently. And
yeah, so I think in some ways you were talking earlier about how difficult it is when you are faced with your own problems, how difficult it is to attend to somebody else's problem. That's the one dimension of that. And then you're also confronted with an issue where something happened that from your eyes is something that's worthy of celebration. Like, I just got into the best school that you could possibly get into Pakistan. So the expectation would be everybody else around you, especially your parents, would be very happy and celebratory. But then the opposite reaction came about, which could have bewildered you. So it's one of those places where it doesn't match your expectations in that moment. One way in which you could have responded was you didn't say anything, or you may have said something in response. But in hindsight, now you recognize that he was a little worried. And it's not that he was completely hopeless or completely didn't know what to do. He just needed to feel a little bit more assured that we're in this together. Like we being you, him and you. And if you merely said something along the lines of, Dad, I'm right here beside you. I'm willing to do whatever I can do to do my part in alleviating some of the weight or the burden that you're on. Even if you actually didn't have to do that later on, just the saying of it takes off a little bit of that load in that very moment and lightens up him in some ways to move forward. That's what you're getting at, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. What do you think was required for you to experience before you have these insights into what you could have done back in the days?
That's the unfortunate part about a lot of these things, right? Which is a lot of times what really requires for you to actually realize this is when it actually happens to you. So it's a function of time, and that can go towards and that can plot towards infinity, which is there's definitely things that I realized more as I left home and actually ended up getting into some of the best colleges. Fast forward, my dad did work really hard for me, and I did graduate from that school with flying honors, and I got a full ride at Yale. I'm still one of the only kids to have gone to Yale from a province of like tens of millions of people ever in Pakistan. So the point is that imagine getting your first paycheck because you're doing like a part-time job in college, and wait, what if I have to give 90% of this away to someone? And what if that's the expectation, right? How would I feel about that? Well, that's exactly what my dad did for all of his life. So it really hits you in the face. And then graduating from college, and then getting married, and then having kids, and then so much realization comes in when you have kids, and then you look retroactively back into when you were a kid. And so for me, I just don't think it was that one moment. It was multiple multiple moments.
Yeah.
And then there definitely certain events in my life that I remember very, very clearly, like sophomore year, actually end of freshman year, MIT was having something called the Vehicle Design Summit, where 80 of the brightest engineers from around the world would be invited to MIT for that summer. So I was working at the Yale solar car team. So me and another friend of mine, we went to MIT for that and for the summers. And I remember I asked my dad if I could buy a car. And so he sent me $3,000 for a car, which like for Pakistan is a lot of money, right? Mm-hmm. And it kept on breaking down every now and then. So one day I was like really upset and I said, like, I sold my car. And he had just told me that he had bought a new car for himself. And my first reaction was, that's what you do. You spend more money on yourself than me. That's such a mean and rude thing to say. And I remember like how my dad was very upset with me for a month.
So at the time, so when you said that that's what you do, you spend more money on you, what do you think were going through your mind?
I think in that moment, I'm like, you could have given me more money for my car. I was just a pissed off sophomore in college at that time and probably entitled as well. I might have been judging my situation compared to some kids that were more privileged than I was at that time. But it's like the relative nature of that thing changes.
Absolutely. And I think it's one of those things where you're surrounded by people who seem to have more, so to speak. And it seems easier and more within grasp, like a car or whatever. And then probably, I'm guessing from your perspective, it may have even been difficult for you to ask your dad to buy you a car, because you probably didn't come from a place where you just like randomly ask your dad for random things. You really had to think about this before you broach that subject. Is that true?
That's true, for sure. It's the worst of the worst. Our parents are in a third world country that like where like average salary for someone who's even very successful is like $1,000 a month. You're here where like $1,000 is nothing, and then you're asking a couple of $1,000 for that. So for sure, that's not easy at all.
Yeah. What emotions did you feel when you found out that he had bought his own car?
In that moment, I had mixed feelings because I was very happy for him, but I was like pretty pissed that my car kept on breaking down. So it's like a mix of both.
What are some of the things that you realize only after you've had your own children?
They say that raising kids is the hardest thing in life that you like doing. Just the sheer velocity that is needed to be able to bring kids up. It's probably by far one of the most thankless jobs in your life. The day the kid arrives, immediately a switch gets turned on where now you have to worry about an actual thing that lives and then like juggle your work with it. It's a huge realization just because being a parent is really, it's incredibly hard because it's a commitment that you're making and where basically for the rest of your life, it's like you're 70 and your kid is 45 or 50 and they screw up somewhere and somehow you feel guilty about it, right? It's like a never ending loop from that perspective. I still see that with my dad. I still see that I've been pretty successful in my life. My sister has been very successful. My older sister, my other siblings have done well. But if one of my siblings hasn't done well, like how like my dad still blames himself for that. And that's a very heavy burden to carry. So I feel like it's something that like starts pretty early.
Yeah. And so when you recognize that sort of burden that you take upon yourself to make sure the livelihood of your children is good, does it impact the way you saw things previously?
Absolutely, for sure. I think one thing that's become incredibly important for me in my life is to not judge people, because it's like I still see people who will hear a part of the story and they'll immediately come to conclusions about that. Maybe I'm in my early 30s and a friend of ours is in their late 40s and like has a teenager. And they're going through all of those challenges with a teenager. And the first reaction is, oh my God, maybe they suck as parents, or maybe the kid is not that nice, and vice versa. Right? It's just like, most likely the same exact thing is going to happen to you as well. So for me, it's become like a important tenet in my life where I just make sure that it's like, that's not the first reaction that's elicited after you, like outside from you. And so as you realize a lot of these things and you look at it and you're like, okay, this is what happened at this point, and this is how it could have been different because it's now happening to me. And if you approach that properly, then it sets you up in your life where you're like, okay, we'll definitely have challenges when we're 45. Definitely have challenges when our kids are teenagers, and it's fine, deal with it.
And so there's like a duality to what you're saying. On the one hand, we as individuals catching ourselves and suspending judgment, But at the same time, there is the reality of life where we may experience the same hurdles that we judge other people for experiencing. And then it's neither good nor bad. It is what it is. What matters is we're going to expect it, right? Whether it happens or not, we're going to, first of all, expect it. And then when it does happen, we will learn to respond to it in a way that we believe is fit for that situation, instead of judging anybody for that matter.
Yeah, sure. Like, and I spend so much time with my son, educating him. My son looks at me and he thinks I'm perfect, which is not true at all. So, and there's this constant like reminders that I have to give him that I'm far from perfect, and here is how I screwed up at your age. And he responds really well to that. Oh my God, okay, so you went through this as well. And so for me, it's been like incredibly important to have those conversations.
So in your relationship with is it your son you're referring to? In that relationship, what were some struggles that you had that you thought once you were able to honestly share your struggles with him, the relationship sort of recovered and he was more receptive to you?
At the end of the day, like my childhood was much easier than his, because like my dad came from a very poor background, and like, he was making his way up in his life. So there weren't a lot of expectations on me personally. So there wasn't any pressure on me. But it's different for my son, right? My son's dad went to Yale, and his granddad was his Hofstra, and then his great granddad, my granddad, was a veteran in the Second World War, fought the Germans in Europe. And it's so easy to look at him and say that, well, you're very privileged and like you've got everything. And then so you should be doing really well. He's an incredibly talented soccer player since he was a very young kid. And I played squash for Yale, and I played squash for Pakistan as well. So like I played at a very high level. And one of the things that I saw myself doing early was, hey, you should be doing better, and you should be doing this. And it's,
you mean doing more sports?
Well, doing way better at soccer, right? Number one at like what you do. Sometimes it's the hardest to empathize with folks who come from the most amount of privilege, right? Because that's not always the best thing out there. My son would be as happy in a 2-bedroom apartment and like working hard in his life as he is today in a bigger house. But so like the privilege really isn't his fault, but there's the amount of extra pressure. So many people forget about this, that amount of pressure that he feels as a 9-year-old.
Yeah.
For me, the bar wasn't that high. For kids like them, like the bar is like incredibly high.
Wow. So was this obvious from the moment he was born, or was there a process that you went through for you to realize, oh, I need to catch myself, I'm forgetting how much pressure he's under?
But definitely over the years, right? Because like 2, 3, 4 years, everyone is having fun. Yeah. And it's become a lot more apparent, like when he's 7 or 8 and I'm standing outside and every move he looks at me, that's heartbreaking. And actually, a really great example. Oh my God, I just remembered. This just happened a couple of weeks back. We're coming back from a game and we're talking about his soccer game. And he's like, how did I do there? And how did I do there? And I'm like, I know you get nervous if I'm giving you instructions from the sidelines in addition to his coach. And yeah, it is. I'm like, so how about we come with a sign language? So like if I do thumbs up 1, that means that your body language is not right. And if I do thumbs down 2, it means that your positional play is not right. And thumbs down 3 means that you're not getting back, you're not tracking back to your position. And you know what he said? He's like, Dad, how about we talk about some of the good things as well? Oh my God, that made me feel so bad. It didn't even occur to me. And he had to say it. So, okay, thumbs up 1 means you're doing well over here. But I think that's a massive kind of realization to me that it shouldn't be the kid telling me that. And that is a classic example of lack of empathy. Right? And it might be unconscious, but that's exactly what it is. So,
what emotions did you feel when you were confronted with this sort of realization that it took him telling you that we need to talk about good things for you to talk about good things?
I mean, guilt for sure. Like, absolutely. I would say a bit of like sadness as well, because it's that realization that like a little 9-year-old soul is telling you that this is what I feel. Because the thing with kids that young is they're not expressive, right? Like they're going to take that and they might internalize a lot of that stuff.
Yeah.
They're not. It takes years for you to be able to express your opinions properly, in life and in that moment. And 9-year-olds are definitely, that's a very early age for them to be able to do that. So you have to be very self-aware and conscious to be able to do that.
In some ways, I'm guessing you're talking about the kind of responsibility that you are willing to take and maybe become more aware of is how you respond to a 9-year-old that you recognize as not yet knowing how to express their feelings, at least in a direct way, in a more articulate way, and being mindful of that, and then also compensating for that and asking yourself, what am I missing? Even though this kid is not telling me, what am I missing? Or what is he really saying by saying those things? And finding out what the implicit sort of hidden language between you and your son may be.
Yeah.
What was sad about the situation for you?
That he had to bring it up. And it's so easy to think that, oh, I am the most empathetic person out there because, oh my God, my life is built around it. Look at how nice I am with this person. Look at what people say about me. But really, this is the realization that, oh my God, look at the times when you're really not empathetic. And that's the dichotomy. It's a very enigmatic feeling, right? That's the only time that he's actually mentioned it. He must have felt it like 9-10 times before he even said it. And not only him, but for in other situations. Like really, that is why I built my current company. Like I thought there was so much lack of empathy in my space out there that we needed to fix that. And generally, we've done a really great job in that. We've drilled into people who work with me that put yourself in their shoes, and I do that for a living, but at the same time, maybe doing really well on the professional side, known to be a very empathetic company out there. But in that moment, failing on home front, right, which is, I should have been thinking about all of this.
Yeah. In some ways, I think what you're getting at is the more empathy is important to us, the more powerful the recognition or the realization when we confront ourselves in the mirror and see that we're not perfect. We're not always empathetic. There are ways in which I'm unaware of certain things or missing in some places. And because much of what we do is based on the platform of empathy, that hits us hard. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. And at the end of the day, the best part about family members, they just call you out on stuff that you need to call out on. So it's interesting when a lot of your close family members make you self-reflect a lot more than others.
Yeah. And I think it's also worth mentioning, your son may have said this 9 or 10 times already in a variety of different ways. It wasn't until this particular situation when he said those things in a particular way that you felt caught off guard and you really confronted the mirror. But even then, some people may still have fought back and said, no, until you improve this and this, there's no place to be arrogant. There's no, place to lose your humility that we all must never forget. And I think that's also fairly common, right?
Yeah. I was thinking something while you're talking, but I lost that train of thought.
But it sounds like you were in a right frame of mind at the time to receive this from your son. And then it had an impact on you. And you were able to catch yourself in the moment and really reflect on it. And to the degree that it was impactful enough to stir a little bit of sadness and guilt in you. Because I think those are powerful emotions that sort of forces you to confront yourself in the mirror.
Right. Introspection is something that's important. And it's become very important for me in life as well. And it's a constant struggle in a way that in that moment, yeah, for sure, I realized it and perhaps took corrective measures in that moment and for the future. But really, at the end of the day, it needs to happen a lot more.
Right. So far, we've been focused on your family, your father, and your son. And earlier, you were saying you built your company on the foundation of empathy. And that's one of the reasons why empathy is such an important topic for you. And if you have many employees, and also there's a lot of sort of complex, constant things that requires your attention, that is a prime situation in which you can lose sight of certain things or have a kind of a blind spot here and there because we're human. What are some struggles you experienced in that work situation?
It's interesting that we're talking about this in today's time because the current situation with COVID has totally exacerbated this. A lot of people are not talking about it as much as they should be. So when COVID hit, you had basically everyone start working from home, right?
Yeah.
It's like immediate talk about the work from home revolution and how much money you save by being not traveling in time and all good right stuff. 7-8 months in, what I'm realizing is actually I was exactly talking about this to a product manager of ours just before our call that you know what this has done, like this work from home, talking behind the screen, it's in such a negative way impacting empathy, because you're all behind the screen. And we get into this a lot, which is, hey, why wasn't this done? Or why wasn't that deadline met? And then everyone is behind.
Yeah.
And it is so hard to, for example, there are times I might not be happy with someone in the company over a certain something. And then with us, to keep some semblance of normality, we're based out of New York, so we were meeting once a month at a restaurant, and like that even can't happen anymore because like it's surging. But a month back, we could still, when restaurants were open, we could still go, and then everyone came into that dinner. When I look someone in the eye, people who I didn't think were up to it, and then I had that conversation in person with them. It makes you realize, oh my God, like that had I said something, had I said to them what I felt in that like a couple of weeks back, it would have permanently damaged a few things. Why? Because you're like behind the screen. So from that perspective, it's a big struggle. I just do not think this current situation of working from home forever sustainable. It will have a serious impact on people's ability to produce properly because of burnout, because what will happen to a less empathetic world, and the picture isn't actually that fun, so we're definitely realizing a lot more of that.
So do you have an example for this work situation where the struggle to empathize was not merely caused by the fact that it was a contrast between work from home versus meeting face to face in a restaurant, but were there situations in which it was just hard to empathize with somebody, but you had a realization later on that helped you empathize with that person?
Oh my God, this happens between the product and the engineering team all the time. Someone told me back in the day that there's always tension between the product and the engineering team. Really, there isn't much tension. There's like lack of empathy on both sides. It's perhaps the product manager is thinking that the engineer is not empathizing with their timelines or like the pressure they're in, and engineers might think that the product managers don't realize the gravity or the gravity of the task, or like the heavy lift that they have to do that. And in my case, there are many situations when I've gone to someone in my company's like content team and said, okay, why was this post not up when we did a big launch? Or going to my chief operating officer and saying, hey, we should have done this better like this. And then realizing that the chief operating officer is actually busier than the CEOs, because the CEOs tend to look at a 3, 6 month, 1 month, 9 month. They have that kind of a view on the company. The chief operating officers have a daily view on the company. They have to deal with stuff on the off side of it that I might not have to deal with. The other day, my CEO messaged me and said, this person actually hasn't taken much vacation and he wants to take the first 10 days of January off in addition to some other time that he wants to take off. And I was like, sure, I have no problem with that. But then I remember messaging him and saying, thank God people don't reach out to me for this. They reach out to you for this, because it gives me more time to focus on other stuff. But the fact is that is an added responsibility that someone like him has. And listen, it goes across the organization. I think building empathy within organizations is so hard. It's much harder than one thinks it is. And you know why? Because for a lot of times when you're working in a company, like the relationship that you have with someone else is very transactional. You might have 3 or 4 or 5 really good friends, but then beyond that, it's a very transactional relationship. And transactions are the opposite of a place where you find empathy.
I'm very curious to hear a little bit more. So you were earlier talking about the difficulties of being a COO, right? I'm very curious to hear, because you mentioned how you were eventually able to appreciate the kind of day-to-day responsibilities and burdens that the COO faces. So before you had that realization, what were some situations where you really struggled to empathize with the COO?
So I think I've been very lucky in that regard. But Michael didn't really start off as a COO in the company. It's just that from day one, he was the kind of guy back in 2016 when we were less than a year old that I had a meeting with him in the first 5 minutes. I realized that, wait, this person, I would love to go out for dinner with him. I'd love to. So our relationship has been built so much around empathy towards each other. If there's been realization out there, whether for him or whether for me, or mostly for me, that, oh, maybe I should have there should be more empathy in that certain aspect. It's very compartmentalized. Like, okay, maybe I could have done better over there.
What's a situation where you thought you could have done better?
So a year and a half, 2 years back, and a lot of times in upper management, if you get into these situations, it's usually because of external pressures. It's always investors are putting pressure on you.
Yes.
For us, so I don't remember the context of it, but it was basically I said something and I was basically like ranting on the situation in general, but I was ranting over an email. And I think Michael thought about it as something where he felt like I was like blaming him for it. It's a very nice way he responded, but I could see a little bit of anger in it. Dude, Ahmed, you can't do this all the time, or like it feels like you're saying this to me, and my immediate reaction was, oh my God, you're right, but that's not what I meant. And to mitigate it, when we met in the office the next day, I was like, let's just make one thing clear, that I need someone to rant to or complain to when I'm not happy about something, because like I need to get it out. It's you. And if you don't want to be that person, it's perfectly fine. Let me know. But if you want to be that person, or if you're okay being that person because you think it'll help us both, then don't ever take anything personally unless I say it's something that's very personal, and then you should call me out. And so I think it's been pretty great after that. But there was definitely that one point where like Michael's reaction was, this is not cool. Why are you coming at me like that? And it wasn't really that I was going at him. I was ranting. But like, see, in that moment as well, I wasn't putting myself in his shoes. I'm not there.
What emotions did you feel when he wrote that email back to you?
It's sad because like, you know, it had made someone else sad. So like, for me, that was a big deal. But like, for sure that a little bit. So remorse on I could have done this better. I'm not there.
Mm-hmm. So did he respond by saying he's willing to be the person to bend to or not?
For sure, he's always been that person. It's just that we just reiterated it like that. Okay, next time it'll be or something like that. But for me, it's a constant evolution as well. Like you learn how to basically complain or rant a little differently. But he's always been that person in the company. Like, absolutely. It's funny how my friends who are similarly situated, even potential investors or someone who meets us, all of them remind me. Oh, you're so lucky because you have Michael, you have a good COO. But I think that's generally true about organizations. How far would have Steve Jobs gone without Tim Cook, and vice versa? You'll probably have pretty much every entrepreneur talk about who their number two in the company is and like what they mean. Yeah.
The kind of yin and yang support, so to speak.
Well, also it's like the COOs are like usually the chief empathy officers, right?
Right.
Because they're the ones, I'm that punching bag towards the world and towards our investors. And so I take a lot of shots from there. But then internally, like your number two person is like really the first line of defense, right? So.
Yeah. So when you look back at your sort of time with the COO, what are some of the things that you most appreciate about him?
He's probably one of the most patient people I've seen. There's one thing that I've actually started doing in my life that like my wife gets really annoyed at, which is, and I actually learned it from Michael, our CEO. Okay. It's like really his fault. But it's in the beginning when you'd ask Michael a question, he has a considerably longer pause than like what like you would consider normal, because that's the amount of thought that he puts in to before he says anything. And really that's just who he is. So in a meeting, someone might ask him a question and then there's this silence. And just when the person who's asked a question either repeats the question or is just about to say something, that's when Michael responds out there. So I've learned that from him. I've really made a practice in my life to think before I speak longer than usual. And I know over the years, my wife has been, oh my God, you take so long to respond to something. It's become that. And I've always been telling her that maybe you should try it as well. So I think like that's like one of his like biggest qualities. And like he's like that generally. He doesn't get fazed easily. He will never respond to something arbitrarily. He'll always think about it and vice versa.
And what made you appreciate that so much from Michael, that pause?
because because I was the opposite of that. So like you always appreciate stuff that like is like lacking in you. I've always been a little more emotional from that perspective. I was probably that person who would respond to you a bit too fast out there. But as you do introspection in your life, you always look at stuff that's like lacking in you, and then you look for those qualities in others. That's really what makes really good organizations, right? Even culturally within US Mobile, we hire, I think Steve Jobs said it, we hire people so that they can teach us stuff out there. If we recruit people that can do what I can do, then there's nothing special about our organization, right? It's really the opposite that you always look for.
What kind of change have you witnessed after you've adopted this pause for yourself that you found very grateful to have?
It actually translates into like life as well. In general, the biggest change is that now if I get an email, like I'll probably think a lot more before I reply to that email out there. In general, maybe taking a second or two to basically to respond to such or something. So for me, the reason behind doing this is to, at least for me, is to like increase the quality of my like responses to people, which is like every time someone is asking me a question, like, am I giving them a thoughtful response? What the impact of this has been, I measure it, right? Like people who, you'd have to ask people who've been with me for a long time. And then when I've actually adopted this change over the last couple of years, what do they feel about that, the other side of it? But sure, it's to elevate like the quality of responses I give people.
So from your perspective, what qualitative difference do you perceive in the way you used to respond versus the one that you adopted the pause?
I think the biggest thing is when you're actually thinking about, a little longer about like responding to something, the kind of first step is, wait, should I actually even be responding to this? Should I just right? Should I actually be going back and saying, actually, honestly, I don't know anything about this. Why don't you tell me? And vice versa. So for me, a big part it has been learned how to curtail any unsolicited like opinions.
Yeah, that resonates a lot. That also directly relates to empathy, right? In the kind of swift response, they're usually trying to solve somebody's problem for them by giving them solicited advice or anything along those lines. But I'm sensing what you're saying is when you inject that pause, you start to ponder the situation as a whole. And does it really actually warrant me getting involved in solving their problem for them or giving them unsolicited advice?
That is actually right. I remember once, like my wife told me that like sometimes you don't always have to solve my problem or someone's problem. Sometimes you just say, okay. Sometimes the other person just wants you to listen to them. And that is so right. Like that's just all, and that's like typical Michael, right? Like a lot of times if I'll go to him about something, like it'll always be, okay, he'll recognize that I just need to say this to him. And I'm not really necessarily looking for his opinion, or maybe there isn't really any opinion that needs to be given in that moment. So
I'm guessing that's one of the reasons why you appreciated being able to vent to Michael, right?
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah. Wow. What emotions do you feel right now in this moment?
Exhausted.
What else besides exhaustion?
I don't know. Kind of thinking about it. It's actually, the right answer for this is I'm actually not sure whether I have a thoughtful response for that.
Oh, I love this. This is so meta.
I'm kind of like,
let's take a pause and don't rush through the answers. Scan what emotions you may be feeling besides the most obvious of exhaustion.
Probably a little bit of self-consciousness. I think it has given me a lot to think about. Like we went down like this memory lane of 20 years, right, of stuff that's weighed so like heavily on me over the years.
Yeah.
But absolutely, I definitely need to call my dad. So definitely need to do that at some point.
What would you like to tell him when you call him?
My relationship with my dad is really interesting in a way that we've always had a very close relationship, but I'd probably reiterate, I'd probably tell him that, hey, I had a conversation with someone on a podcast and like, it made me thank you again for what you've done in my life. So I would say that I appreciate what he's done and like maybe talk about a few things in life, like a few stories and vice versa. But usually when I start like this, he stops me and says, I really appreciate it. And then he starts telling me one of his stories. But I think I'd like appreciation for what he's done.
So in some ways, fully being able to articulate and communicate, kind of like once again, I think your son is at the heart of all this, because it's kind of like you're now in your son's place where you really want to say this thing to the fullest extent that you believe it deserves, the sort of expression of gratitude and appreciation toward your father, even though from a father's perspective, they typically say, oh, it's nothing. It's, of course I would have done this for you. You're my son, et cetera, et cetera. But there is something to be said about the person on the receiving end being able to articulate their expression of appreciation and gratitude to the fullest extent. Does that resonate?
That is absolutely what it is. Right.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for that. That sort of signals to me that gratitude is also something that you're experiencing in this moment.
Oh my God, a lot. Like that's you found that word. So I think that like absolutely, like I think gratitude is like probably at the top of it for sure.
So I'm also experiencing this sort of gratitude, especially toward your son, because I'm sensing that sort of his figure in the kind of the overarching story that you talked about, not only your father, but also with people at work and also your relationship with son. He seems to be the unflinching mirror. He embodies exactly what we just talked about, which is his desire to be able to articulate his feelings in a way that he wants it to be heard. That sort of relates to the situation. And also the idea that we as human beings, no matter our age, whether we're 70, whether we're 9, whether we're 40 or whatever, there is that part of us that want to be able to feel appreciated, that want to matter. And as long as we all are aware of the fact that is part of who we are as human beings, and not fall into the trap of thinking you're a professional or you're a this or you're a that, these sort of labels and judgments that we put them, and we forget that they're actual human beings who bleed and have these sort of need to matter, and the ease with which we can navigate once we accept that. What you were saying earlier about when you think of them as kind of workers that must be transacted against, especially during a work from home situation, and then you meet them face to face at a restaurant as human beings who eat and breathe and spit and these things, then you start to realize, oh, you know what? The feeling I had 2 weeks ago, that sort of forgotten that humanity aspect. And I'm glad that I waited.
But it's recurring, right? You feel that, and then but it's so hard to go back to your life. And I think that is something that needs to be mitigated. Like someone has to find a way to mitigate that.
And I think in some ways, one of the ways I feel appreciative and gratitude towards you is you took the time today. In some ways, in the beginning, I saw the side of this conversation where I'm appreciating you for willing to talk about a difficult subject matter. But in doing so, I think you've demonstrated exactly what you just said, which is taking that time to pause and reflect on the humanity that surrounds us all, whether it's our fathers, our sons, or people who we work with. And it's when we take that Michael pause, let's call it, then and only then we have that little bit of space or that little gap or whatever you will, that where that humanity seeps in and we're able to take a little bit of breather and reflect on that matter. Because otherwise we're just going busy, the next task. How do we get ABC done? Then it becomes all transaction. Does that resonate?
It does. And that's what it is, right? At the end of the day, it's putting yourself in someone else's shoes and kind of inspect the scene from that point, when.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ahmed, for taking that time on top of your willingness to talk about a subject that's very personal to you and potentially difficult to discuss in a kind of the climate that we're living in. It's music to my ears. It's inspiration. And I hope other people who are listening in would also be able to take a bit of a pause and breather in the way you have, and then sort of think about their family members and people they work with. And what's that?
Take a Michael pause.
All right, the Michael pause.
It's like, next time, when I need someone to calm down, I'd be like, why don't you take a Michael pause?
Exactly. I think naming it, make it very prominent. And I think it's something that's quite helpful to have. So to Michael pause, shall we all give ourselves a bit of a break and then navigate this situation with COVID and come out the other end alive and prospering?
Thank you so much. Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Ahmed, for coming in. May you stay beautiful.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hey there, listener. Thank you for listening to the very end. I believe we can mature and innovate by navigating the difficult journey of realizing empathy in the face of tension. What I've learned from my own experience is that all of our challenges in empathizing with others is ultimately an opportunity to realize empathy with ourselves, to develop a greater understanding and appreciation of who we are and who we can be when we feel connected. And this journey is difficult. Let's not sugarcoat it. This is especially so if you go at it alone. So I envision a world where each and every one of us, from the moment we're born until the day we die, can feel certain there's at least one person we can reach out to at any given moment who can and will support us in this journey in a way that actually makes us feel supported. If you share this belief, please subscribe to our YouTube and podcast channels, and also like and share this episode, as well as leave a review of our podcast so more people can enjoy it. And if you believe you know somebody who can be a great guest for our show, please send us email at podcast@realizingempathy.com. We absolutely love hearing from you. Thank you once again, and until next time, may you stay beautiful.